The rain fell in cold sheets across the proving grounds of Sterling Armaments Company in Dagenham, Essex. November 1944. The mud clung to everything: boots, machinery, hope. George William Patchett knelt at the firing line, hands steady on the device that had consumed 18 months of his life. Behind him, military observers huddled beneath a canvas awning, their greatcoats dark with rain, their faces carved with skepticism. They had seen this before. Another designer promising miracles. Another man claiming he could improve on the Sten, Britain's crude, mass-produced answer to desperate need. An officer muttered something about engineering fantasy. Patchett didn't turn around. He'd heard worse. The Sterling submachine gun, though it wouldn't carry that name for years, looked deceptively simple. Clean lines, minimal parts, nothing wasted. But what it represented was anything but simple. It was an argument against conventional wisdom, written in steel and precision. Patchett raised the tool, sighted, squeezed. The Sterling roared to life, sending rounds downrange in a controlled burst. Then Patchett did something that made the observers lean forward. He lowered it deliberately into the mud, coating the mechanism in thick, wet clay. Lifted it, triggered it. Perfect function. He submerged it in a water trough. Used it again. Not a single stoppage. The officers stopped talking. 2 years earlier, in the spring of 1942, Patchett had walked into a different kind of silence. The design office at Sterling Armaments, where precision manufacturing had been the pride before global conflict, transformed everything. He'd carried technical drawings and a stack of failure reports, documentation of Sten malfunctions compiled from personnel testimonies, field observations, and grim statistics. His supervisor, Mr. Holloway, had listened with the patience of a man who'd already heard too many proposals. The Sten serves its purpose, Patchett. 4 million produced. It's winning the struggle for us. It's also causing the loss of our people, Patchett had replied quietly. Not from opposing fire, from accidental discharge, from jamming in engagement, from design compromises we accepted because we were desperate. We're still desperate. And the Sten is in production, which is why we need something better for after. This struggle will end. The next threat won't wait for us to improvise. Holloway had studied the drawings. The curved magazine feeding from below, the telescoping bolt, the ribbed barrel design, all achievable with the same stamped metal technology, the same tools, the same skill level as the Sten, but engineered, not improvised. Limited resources, Holloway had finally said. Small workshop, weekend time. And Patchett, if this fails, don't expect the ministry to bail you out. That had been permission enough. The Sten's failures were legend among those who carried it. It jammed in conditions that shouldn't matter: clean, dirty, cold, hot. The side-mounted magazine fought gravity with every round. The open bolt made accuracy nearly impossible and turned every drop into a potential tragedy. Airborne units whispered stories of Stens discharging in aircraft, striking personnel before they reached the drop zone. Infantry learned not to trust it in close quarters. Yet the device had saved Britain in 1940, when an arrival loomed and automatic tools were scarce. Designed for bicycle shops and radio factories, built from stamped metal with minimal machining, the Sten had flooded into British hands by the millions. A triumph of expedient engineering. A tool that could be made anywhere, by anyone, almost overnight. But the users disliked it, and that sentiment was written in deep loss. Patchett had understood something the procurement officers didn't. The Sten wasn't simple. It was crude. There was a profound difference. Simplicity could be elegant. Crudeness was just unfinished. Now, standing in the November rain of 1944, watching officers examine his Sterling with new eyes, Patchett felt the weight of those 2 years. The sleepless nights. The failed prototypes. The calculations scratched on blueprint margins at 3 a.m., the quiet ridicule from peers who thought him obsessed with perfection in a time that demanded merely good enough. The tool had 43 parts, 4 fewer than the Sten. But those missing parts represented thousands of hours, countless iterations, and an uncompromising vision of what simplicity could achieve when executed with precision rather than desperation. One officer picked up the Sterling, testing its weight, working the action. He looked at Patchett with something new in his expression. Not quite belief, not yet, but possibility. "How long until you can produce these?" Patchett met his gaze. "The conflict will be over before we retool production. This isn't for now, it's for what comes next." The officer nodded slowly, rain streaming down his cap. "Show us more. If stories like this make you question what you'd do when everyone says you're wrong, but you know you're right, tell us in the comments, and stay with us for the next chapters. When can perfection justify itself in a world that settles for good enough? Dagenham in winter carried the smell of industry and rain. The Sterling Armaments Workshop, tucked in the back of the factory complex, had become Patchett's second home, sometimes his first. His wife, Margaret, had learned to leave dinner wrapped in the oven, knowing he'd return after midnight, hands stained with oil, mind still running calculations. The Sten's fundamental flaw wasn't hard to identify. Any engineer could see it. The side-mounted magazine created a feeding angle that fought physics. Gravity and motion conspired against reliability. Every field condition, running, diving, rolling, made the problem worse. But identifying problems was easy. Solutions were harder. Patchett had grown up in Sheffield, son of a toolmaker. His childhood was measured in the sound of precision machinery, the satisfaction of parts fitting exactly as designed. His father had taught him that tolerance wasn't just a measurement, it was a philosophy. The difference between something that worked and something that worked reliably lived in fractions of millimeters and in understanding how parts interacted under stress. Before the global crisis, Sterling Armaments had built sporting equipment and precision instruments. Then 1939 arrived, and everything changed. The factory retooled for Sten production, like thousands of others across Britain. Patchett had worked on the line, assembling tools he knew were flawed. Each one that passed through his hands felt like a compromise he was personally handing to a service member. In early 1942, he'd approached Mr. Holloway with more than drawings. He'd brought a philosophy. "An automatic tool needs to do 4 things," he'd explained, spreading blueprints across the cluttered desk. "Feed ammunition reliably, contain the energy safely, eject spent casings, repeat the cycle as long as the triggers held. Everything else is negotiable. The Sten does those things when it works. But we designed for manufacturing ease, not functional reliability. Every shortcut created failure points. I want to design with the same manufacturing constraints, but without compromising function." Holloway had studied him with the weariness of a man managing production during a crisis. "You're asking to pursue perfection in the middle of a total struggle. I'm asking to pursue reliability. There's a difference." The first prototype had taken 4 months. Patchett worked evenings and weekends, occasionally with quiet help from Harold, a senior machinist who understood what Patchett was attempting. Harold would leave tools positioned just so, or mention casually that the workshop would be empty Saturday morning. The curved magazine that fed from below was the first breakthrough, using gravity as an ally instead of an enemy. The second was the bolt design. 2 rollers that delayed the opening sequence just enough to ensure safe pressures, adding reliability without adding complexity or parts. Every component served multiple purposes. The magazine housing integrated into the receiver, reducing parts. The bolt telescoped over the barrel, keeping the tool short without sacrificing barrel length. The ribbed barrel allowed air cooling without adding weight. By autumn 1942, Patchett had something that looked elegant, almost civilian in its clean proportions. Officers who saw it assumed it would be expensive to produce. They were wrong. He'd used the same stamped metal technology as the Sten, the same basic tools, the same skill level of machinist. But where the Sten was improvised simplicity, the Sterling was refined simplicity. Every part had been thought through, every tolerance calculated, every interaction between components engineered rather than approximated. The first live tests were encouraging. The tool functioned reliably under normal conditions, but Patchett knew normal conditions were irrelevant. Combat wasn't normal. So he began subjecting prototypes to torture tests that made observers wince. He coated mechanisms in sand and used them. He froze them overnight, then tested them at dawn. He baked them in ovens. He dropped them from heights that would have shattered a Steen. He dragged them through mud, through water, through conditions no equipment should encounter and still be expected to function. And slowly, through each failure, he refined the design. A stronger spring here, a different angle there. Tolerances tightened in one place, loosened in another. Each iteration was a conversation with physics, with materials, with the brutal realities of the field. Harold watched one morning as Patchett disassembled a prototype that had failed after 200 rounds in freezing conditions. Most men would have given up by now, Harold said quietly. Patchett didn't look up from the bolt mechanism. Most men aren't thinking about the paratrooper whose tool discharges in the aircraft, or the infantryman whose equipment jams when he needs it most. This isn't about giving up or not giving up. It's about getting it right. What if right isn't possible? Then we keep trying until it is. Margaret asked him once, late at night when he finally came home, why this mattered so much. They had no children to protect. The struggle would end with or without his tool. Why sacrifice their evenings, their peace, their normalcy? Patchett had struggled to explain. How do you describe the weight of knowing that the difference between crude and elegant could be measured in lives? That somewhere, people were betting their survival on tools designed for expedient production rather than reliable function. Because I can see the solution, he'd finally said. And if I can see it and don't pursue it, then every failure that comes after is partially mine. She'd held his oil-stained hands and nodded, even though he knew she didn't fully understand. By late 1943, the prototypes were performing beyond expectations, consistently, reliably, in conditions that would disable a Sten. But the timing was cruel. The struggle in Europe was accelerating toward its conclusion. The Ministry of Supply was winding down production, not ramping up. There would be no mass adoption of a new tool, no matter how superior, with victory in sight. Patchett could have stopped, could have returned to normal factory work, to evening dinners, to a life without oil under his fingernails. Instead, he continued refining. Because he believed what he'd told Holloway in 1942, the end of the conflict wouldn't end the need for reliable automatic equipment. The winter of 1943 brought news from the front that validated everything Patchett had feared. A report from Italy, a sergeant's letter that somehow found its way to Sterling Armaments, described a night patrol gone wrong. 8 men, 6 Stens, 4 jammed in the first exchange, 2 men lost because their equipment failed when needed most. Patchett read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in his desk drawer. Not as evidence, as a reminder, as weight. The workshop in Dagenham had become a shrine to iteration. Walls covered with technical drawings, each one marked with notes in Patchett's precise hand. Failed prototypes lined shelves like archaeological artifacts of the path toward solution. Each represented a lesson, a conversation with physics and materials that had taught him something essential. The Ministry of Supply sent occasional inspectors. They were polite but non-committal. Their reports used words like promising and interesting, while recommending no immediate action. In a total struggle, good enough was doctrine. Improvement was luxury, but Lieutenant Shaw, a young officer recovering from injuries in North Africa, saw something different when he visited in February 1944. He'd carried a Sten through 2 campaigns, knew its failures intimately. Patchett handed him the Sterling without preamble. Shaw worked the action, feeling the smoothness of the mechanism, the balance of the weight. He looked up, eyes sharp. "May I test it?" They went to the small range behind the factory. Shaw used it in controlled bursts, then rapid fire. Dropped the tool deliberately in mud, picked it up, used it again. Submerged it in a water barrel, used it again. His expression shifted from professional interest to something approaching reverence. "This is what we needed," he said quietly. 2 years ago, before we lost people to tools that failed us. "Can you document that?" Patchett asked. "Your evaluation, your experience with the Sten versus this. Who will read it? I don't know yet, but when the struggle ends, someone will ask what comes next. I want them to hear from those who use them, not just engineers." Shaw nodded and spent the next hour writing the most detailed technical evaluation Patchett had ever received from an operator. He ended with a line that Patchett would remember for years. "This tool doesn't just work. It works when nothing else does. That's what service members need." But spring 1944 brought a different kind of pressure. Sterling Armaments needed Patchett back on Sten production. A major operation was being prepared. Demand for equipment, even flawed equipment, was overwhelming. His weekend project was becoming a distraction the company could no longer afford. Mr. Holloway called him in on a morning when rain hammered the factory roof. "I've protected this project as long as I can," Holloway said, "but the board wants you back on the line, full time." 3 more months, Patchett said. "I'm close." "Close to what? A tool no one will adopt? A solution to a problem we've already solved with 4 million Stens? Close to proving that reliable isn't the same as functional, that we can do better than good enough." Holloway sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'll give you until November. After that, this ends. The conflict will be decided by then, one way or another." Margaret's concern manifested in quiet ways. Meals eaten in silence. Evenings where she'd sit reading while he worked at the kitchen table, blueprints spread among the dishes. Once she'd asked if it was worth it. The obsession, the sacrifice of their time together, the burden he carried. "I don't know if it's worth it," he'd admitted. "I only know I can't stop until I know if it's possible." Harold helped in ways that bent rules without breaking them. Materials appeared in the workshop without formal requisitions. Tools were accidentally left accessible. Once Patchett found a note on his bench. "Testing data from Arctic trials attached. Thought you should see. H." The data showed Sten failures in cold weather conditions, specific temperatures, specific failure modes, information Patchett needed to refine his bolt design for extreme conditions. The final prototypes came together through summer 1944. Each part precisely toleranced, each interaction between components carefully engineered. The tool had 43 parts total, 4 fewer than the Sten. But those missing parts represented the distillation of 2 years of obsessive refinement. One evening in September, Patchett held the completed Sterling and felt its weight. Not just the physical weight of steel and mechanism, but the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. The evenings away from Margaret, the ridicule from colleagues who thought him foolish, the knowledge that he was pursuing perfection in a world that had settled for expedient. Harold found him in the workshop that night. "You've done it," Harold said simply. "I've made something that works," Patchett corrected. "Whether it matters is something else entirely." "It will matter. Maybe not now, but it will." The November 1944 demonstration on the Dagenham Proving Grounds was Patchett's last chance to prove the Sterling's worth before his time ran out. The mud test that made officers stop talking, the moment when theory became undeniable reality. But even as observers examined the tool with new interest, the timeline of the struggle was working against him. Victory was months away. The ministry was winding down, not scaling up. Do you think you'd fight the system for what you believe works, or accept what doctrine says is impossible? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real innovation stories from history. How long can you design for a future no one believes will need what you're building? The winter after the mud test was the hardest season Patchett could remember, not because of cold, though the workshop in Dagenham was barely heated, but because of uncertainty. The Sterling had proven itself. Officers had seen it function under conditions that destroyed Stens, but proving and adopting were separated by vast institutional distances. The conflict ended in May 1945. The factories began to wind down. Sten production slowed, then stopped. Sterling Armaments transitioned back toward civilian manufacturing. Patchett returned to the regular workshop floor. The Sterling prototypes stored in a locked cabinet like artifacts of a struggle that hadn't quite happened. Margaret noticed the change in him, the quietness that went beyond his natural reserve, the way he'd pause sometimes, tools in hand, looking at nothing in particular. "It's done," she said one evening. "You did everything you could." "I proved it works." "That's not the same as it mattering." "It might still matter." "When? How?" She had no answer for that. Neither did he. But history had its own timeline. In 1947, the British Army issued a formal requirement for a new automatic tool to replace the Sten. The great struggle was over, but the world wasn't at peace. Malaya, Palestine, Kenya, regional conflicts that needed reliable equipment in tropical heat, desert sand, jungle humidity. Conditions where the Sten's flaws were becoming impossible to ignore. The letter arrived at Sterling Armaments in January 1947, an invitation to submit designs for evaluation. Patchett read it 3 times in disbelief. Mr. Holloway, now factory director, called him into the office with something approaching a smile. "Dust off your prototypes," he said. "You're about to get your chance." The trials were exhaustive. The Sterling competed against designs from BSA, MCEM, and several foreign manufacturers. Over 3 years, the equipment was tested in conditions ranging from Arctic cold to tropical heat, desert sand, jungle mud, salt water exposure, drop tests, endurance usage, every scenario designed to find breaking points. The Sterling didn't break. Harold, now retired but following the trials with keen interest, visited Patchett during the testing period. "You knew this would happen," Harold said. "That's why you kept going after 45. "I hoped," Patchett corrected. "I didn't know." There's a difference. The breakthrough came in the jungle trials. British forces in Malaya were facing an insurgency that required tools capable of functioning in humidity, that rusted metal and mud that jammed mechanisms. Stens failed regularly. The trial Sterlings functioned flawlessly through weeks of field testing. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce, supervising the Malaya trials, wrote a report that became part of the official evaluation. In 17 days of jungle operations, the Sterling test tools experienced 0 malfunctions across 4,000 rounds used. The Sten equipment provided for comparison experienced 12 malfunctions, requiring field stripping. The difference is not marginal, it's transformative. But institutional inertia was powerful. The trials dragged on. Questions were raised about manufacturing costs, about retraining requirements, about whether the improvement justified the disruption. Every argument Patchett had heard in 1942 returned in new forms. What changed everything was statistics. By 1950, the accumulated data was undeniable. Failure rates, maintenance hours, operator evaluations. The numbers told a story that doctrine couldn't refute. The Sterling was reliably better, not incrementally, substantially. A procurement officer named Anderson became an unexpected advocate. He'd reviewed every test result, read every field report, compared every metric. He'd also lost a sibling in Italy, whose life was lost when his Sten jammed during an engagement. Anderson scheduled a meeting with the procurement board in early 1951. Patchett was invited to attend. The boardroom was nothing like the workshop. Polished wood, portraits of former leaders. Men in suits who viewed equipment as budget line items rather than tools people bet their survival on. Anderson presented the data with clinical precision. Then he looked at the board. Gentlemen, every metric confirms what field operators have been telling us. This tool represents a substantial improvement in reliability. The question isn't whether it's better. It's whether we have the courage to adopt better when good enough is already in inventory. A colonel, a veteran of North Africa with 3 injury stripes, studied Patchett. The reports say you designed this during the struggle. Why? Because I knew we'd need it after, Patchett answered. Conflicts end, threats don't. And you continued development after funding ended on your own time? Yes, sir. Why? Patchett considered the question. In this room, with these men, simple truth seemed the only option. Because I'd seen the Sten failure reports. And I knew the difference between crude and elegant wasn't just engineering philosophy. It was about saving lives. The room was silent for a long moment. Gentlemen, the colonel said, I recommend immediate adoption. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. In 1953, the Sterling was officially adopted as the L2A1, becoming the British Army's standard automatic tool. 8 years after the global conflict ended, 11 years after Patchett had first proposed designing it. The telegram arrived at his home on a Friday evening. Margaret read it, then handed it to him wordlessly. Patchett sat down heavily, the paper shaking slightly in his hands. Not from emotion, though that was there, but from the sheer relief of validation, of being proven right after so many years of uncertainty. Was it worth it? Margaret asked softly. He looked at her, thinking of the evenings lost, the ridicule endured, the years of doubt. Ask me again in 20 years, he said. The Sterling's first major combat deployment came in Malaya in 1954. British forces facing insurgents in jungle terrain found themselves with a tool that functioned in conditions that had plagued them for years. No more malfunctions from humidity, no more jams from mud, no more maintenance nightmares in the field. Lieutenant Colonel George Stiles, commanding a company in the dense jungles near Ipoh, wrote in his campaign diary, "The new Sterling SMG has transformed close-quarters operations. In 3 months of jungle patrols, 0 equipment malfunctions, 0. Personnel who carried Stens for years can't believe it. They joke about dragging it through a swamp just to test it. Then they actually do, and it still functions. That kind of reliability changes how people think about engagement. One less thing to worry about. In the jungle, that might save you." The reports began filtering back to England, not through official channels initially, but through letters. Operators writing to tell Patchett, somehow they'd learned his name, that the tool worked, that it didn't fail them, that for the first time they trusted their equipment completely. Patchett kept every letter, not as trophies, but as evidence that the years had mattered, that the pursuit of reliable over expedient had been justified by something more than engineering pride. The Sterling served British forces through conflicts that spanned decades. Kenya, Cyprus, Aden, Northern Ireland, the Falklands. Each environment tested the tool in different ways: desert sand, urban engagement, cold rain, tropical heat. In all of them, the Sterling functioned, always. But the tool's success reached far beyond British service. Over 70 countries adopted it. Special units continued requesting it decades after more modern equipment became available. Not because it was cutting edge, it wasn't, but because they trusted it absolutely. That trust, earned through consistent reliability, proved more valuable than any technical innovation. What made the Sterling remarkable wasn't any single innovation. The curved magazine, the telescoping bolt, the ribbed barrel, these were incremental improvements, not revolutionary leaps. What made it remarkable was the philosophy behind it. Patchett had understood something profound, that reliability in design comes not from adding redundant systems or complex mechanisms, but from perfecting simple ones. Every part of the Sterling worked with every other part. There were no afterthoughts. No compromises left unresolved, no weak links tolerated. The tool had only 43 parts total. The Sten had 47. But those 4 fewer parts represented thousands of hours of design work, countless prototypes, and an uncompromising vision of what simplicity could achieve when executed with precision. In 1958, a historian from the Imperial War Museum visited Sterling Armaments to document the tool's development. Patchett, now in his 50s, spent an afternoon walking the historian through the design evolution, the prototypes, the test data, the failure reports that had started everything. "Why didn't you give up?" the historian asked. "In 1945, when the struggle ended, and no one wanted your tool?" Patchett considered the question carefully. "Because I knew what I'd built worked. And I knew eventually reality would force doctrine to acknowledge that. It just took longer than I hoped." "Do you feel vindicated?" "I feel relieved," Patchett answered. "Vindication suggests I needed to prove something to others. I needed to prove it to myself, that pursuing reliable over expedient was worth the cost." The historian's report, published in 1960, concluded, "The Sterling represents a case study in how institutional resistance to innovation can delay but not ultimately prevent the adoption of superior solutions." Patchett's persistence through years of indifference demonstrates that in technology, being right matters less than being right at the right time, or being willing to wait until the time is right. By the mid-1960s, the Sterling had become standard, not just in British service, but internationally. Production ran into the hundreds of thousands. The tool Patchett had designed in a small workshop in Dagenham, working evenings and weekends, had become a global standard for reliability. Yet Patchett himself remained largely unknown. He wasn't a public figure, wasn't a military hero. He was an engineer who'd believed in doing things properly, who'd refused to accept that good enough was sufficient when genuinely good was achievable. When interviewed years later about the Sterling's longevity, he dismissed the praise with characteristic understatement. "We simply made sure every part did exactly what it needed to do, and nothing more. There's no mystery to it." But there was mystery, of a sort. The mystery of why perfection often appears simple, even though achieving simplicity requires the deepest complexity of thought. The mystery of why the best solutions often seem obvious in retrospect, even though they were invisible to everyone before one person saw them clearly. The Sterling's service life proved Patchett's philosophy. From 1953 to 1994, 41 years, it served British forces faithfully. Through the mud of Borneo, the dust of Oman, the cold rain of Belfast, the Sterling functioned. Always. Those who carried it in the field remember it not for any single dramatic moment, but for its absolute consistency. The tool that was always there, always ready, always reliable. In the calculus of conflict, that kind of dependability became more valuable than any technical innovation, more important than any feature list. The principle behind the tool endured longer than the tool itself. The idea that perfecting simplicity requires more courage than adding complexity, more wisdom than accumulating features, more vision than following convention. George William Patchett understood this. The Sterling was proof, and 4 decades of personnel betting their lives on that understanding was vindication enough for any designer. The Sterling was withdrawn from British service in 1994, replaced by the more modern L-85 equipment family. Patchett didn't live to see it. He passed away in 1964, having spent most of his life in relative obscurity. He never sought fame, he sought solutions. The Sterling was his answer to a question most people thought had already been answered. How simple can an automatic tool be? The real question he answered was deeper. How perfect can simplicity become? In museums and collections across Britain, the Sterling sits beside the Sten, its crude ancestor. The visual contrast tells the story better than words. One tool improvised in desperation, the other perfected in determination. Both simple, only one elegant. Margaret lived another 30 years after Patchett's passing. She donated his notebooks to the Imperial War Museum in 1989, detailed records of every prototype, every test, every failure and success that had led to the Sterling's final form. The curator who received them spent weeks reading through Patchett's meticulous notes and found something unexpected: poetry in technical precision. Each entry revealed a mind that saw beauty in function, elegance in reliability, meaning in getting details exactly right. One notebook entry, dated September 3, 1944, read, "Tolerance isn't just a measurement. It's a promise to the person who will trust their survival to this mechanism. Every fraction of a millimeter matters because existence is measured in fractions." Harold, who'd helped quietly through the struggle years, gave an interview to a technology magazine in 1987. By then, in his 80s, he spoke about watching Patchett work through those long evenings in Dagenham. "He was the most stubborn man I ever met," Harold said, smiling. But his stubbornness wasn't about ego, it was about responsibility. He felt personally responsible for everyone who might carry what he designed. That kind of responsibility makes you precise in ways ego never could. The professional community gradually recognized what Patchett had achieved. The curved magazine, feeding from below, became an industry standard worldwide. The concept of designing for reliability through elegant simplicity rather than redundant complexity became a touchstone principle taught in engineering programs. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came not from institutions, but from those in the field. Veterans who'd carried the Sterling in engagement began, in their later years, to write about their experiences. Not dramatic stories, but quiet testimonials to reliability. A sergeant who'd served in Northern Ireland through the 1970s wrote, "I carried that Sterling for 3 years, through rain that never stopped, stress that never quit, situations where one malfunction could mean everything. It never failed me, not once." That kind of trust between a person and their equipment, you can't design it, but somehow someone did. A warrant officer from the Falklands campaign remembered, "The day we landed at San Carlos, my Sterling was soaked with seawater. I expected problems. There were none. Later, moving through mud at Goose Green, I expected jams. Nothing. The tool just worked. Always. You stop thinking about it." That's the highest compliment a person can give their equipment. You stop thinking about whether it will function and focus on the mission. These accounts, collected by historians, revealed something Patchett himself might have appreciated: that the tool's greatest achievement was becoming invisible. So reliable that operators stopped worrying about it. So consistent that it faded into background trust, allowing people to focus on survival rather than equipment failure. The Sterling's influence persists decades after its withdrawal from service. Engineers studying design still examine its principles: how it achieved exceptional reliability with minimal parts, how elegant engineering solved problems that crude improvisation had only addressed, how patient refinement produced solutions that hasty expedients had missed. In 2003, a technology symposium dedicated a session to Lessons from the Sterling. Speakers included designers, historians, and veterans. The consensus was striking. Patchett had proven that the distance between good enough and genuinely good wasn't about adding complexity. It was about understanding deeply enough to subtract it. One presenter closed his talk with a question Patchett had written in his notebooks: "What is the cost of pursuing perfect when adequate exists? And what is the cost of settling for adequate when perfect is achievable?" Margaret, attending in Patchett's memory, sat in the audience and wept quietly. Not from grief, she'd made peace with his passing decades earlier, but from recognition. These people understood what her husband had spent years pursuing, understood why he'd sacrificed evenings, endured ridicule, persisted through institutional indifference. After the symposium, a young engineer approached her. "Did he know?" the engineer asked. "Before he passed, did he know how much it mattered?" Margaret thought carefully before answering. He knew people trusted it. That's what mattered to him. Not legacy, not recognition, just that it worked when they needed it. The Sterling story became a parable about innovation, persistence, and the courage to be right before anyone believes you. About how changing the way things are done often means changing doctrine. And how changing doctrine requires not just being correct, but being patient enough to wait for reality to prove your case. In the end, it wasn't the tool that endured longest, it was the principle behind it. The idea that perfecting simplicity requires more courage than adding complexity, more wisdom than accumulating features, more vision than following convention. George William Patchett understood this. The Sterling was proof, and 4 decades of people betting their survival on that understanding was vindication enough for any designer. The mind behind the tool asked only that it work, always. In return, it answered faithfully for 41 years. If this story reminded you that changing the world often means being right before anyone believes you, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What does it cost to see what needs to exist when everyone else sees only what is?